I pre-recorded mine, just 'cause I was having voice issues and I was worried that like I'd lose my voice by today. So I pre-recorded. So I'm going to still be at 12 minutes, but if you guys want to take a little longer, you could each even go 20 minutes if you'd like.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
12.
Yes, welcome, Eric.
Yes, hi.
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Yeah, I don't know. My video is on, but I can't see myself either. So I don't know if the support person is still there, or does anybody have ideas about what this could be?
Well,
Maybe log out and log back in again and just see if that
Okay.
helps.
Okay, let me try that. Thank you.
It does. You can log out and log back in and join just as if you had joined on early.
Okay.
so I thought we would go, I'm listed as the first, well, no, who's listed first? Annette, you're listed first in the program. And then it looks like I'm listed next, and then it looks like Emily's listed next, and Marquita is listed fourth. My original plan was I was just going to go last, so in case there was some technical difficulty, but it looks like we've got plenty of buffer time with Marquita not being here. So I think I just would like to go just in the order that it's in the program, if that works for folks.
It's fine with me.
Okay.
And Beth, what time does the session end, out of curiosity?
I believe it's a full 2 hours.
Okay.
Is that what other people think?
I have no idea because obviously I almost didn't make it on time. So
That's pretty funny. Let me see if it's still.
I saw on the program that we were supposed to end promptly at 2:15. Well, 2:15 Eastern.
Eastern.
I should specify, yes.
Well, that is exactly 2 hours. Yes.
Yep.
good.
And then
That's my-
the cutoff is automatic, so it's not like somebody ending it. So yeah, make sure that you have a little buffer as you're saying your goodbyes.
Okay.
So do we want to do, actually, there are 3, would we like to do questions, hold them till the end?
I
think
prefer it.
I do too. I think it's less sort of disruptive. Paul,
Yeah.
Paul, Brian, how do you like to be addressed? Paul, Brian, Paul, Brian?
This is my sort of like Garfinklian little exercise. Whatever is best, whatever is most comfortable for you. I don't have any preference.
It's my first time.
PD works.
Live.
Paul works. Yeah.
Okay, real good.
Thank you for asking.
Thanks. Okay, so Paul and Eric, would you like to go before questions? Like to have the 3 of us talk and then do your comments and then have questions at the very end? Or did you want to intersperse in any way, or?
I don't have a strong preference. It might make sense for Eric and I to go before the general Q&A, just so maybe we would help generate the discussion. That's how I sort of perceived my role, is sort of to help generate, guide discussion. So I think it would make sense.
That sounds good.
We have eight.
That sounds great.
We have 8 people in attendance beyond us. Just
Oh, beyond us. Awesome.
Yeah.
But we can't see them. That's how. So our
No.
mysterious audience.
but I just clicked on participants, so we have yeah.
15, yeah, total with us. Yeah. Eric, it looks like Mike, the ASA support person, is here. Eric, did you need help getting we had seen a visual for you for a moment there.
We
Yeah.
have some kind of visual.
I don't know, for some reason I have my video on, but none of us can see anything but a black screen. Do you have any suggestions about that?
You're referring to Mike?
Who is having problems?
Me,
Eric?
Eric Larson.
Eric Larson. Do you have one of those little plastic things that covers your camera?
No.
All right.
Eric, for a moment we were seeing what looked like your white ceiling.
Yeah, that's called camera view rear. But that,
Yeah,
oh,
that doesn't help if you're in
I
front
guess
of.
I could turn myself around here. This is, but then I can't really,
You can't see your,
maybe I can't really see what other people are seeing if I turn my computer around.
Yeah, that's got to be a setting, Eric, on your laptop. I'm not totally positive. I can maybe ask some questions on my end and see how we can get your settings done on your laptop.
Okay, I'll look around too. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
and can you guys can chat about that in the chat,
Correct.
right? Eric and Mike? Okay,
Okay.
great. Thank you, Mike. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. As Emily pointed out, we have a number of guests joining us. Thank you so much for coming to this panel. This panel is entitled Connections to Employment, Precarious, Tenuous, and Difficult Situations. We have several great papers as well as two awesome discussants. What we're going to do is we're going to speak in the order that we appear in the program. And following that, we'll hear comments by our discussants. And then after that, we'll open it up for questions from all of you. So I'm going to let each person introduce themselves. And I'm going to it's a Zoom. I'm going to focus my attention along with the rest of you on Dr. Annette Nierobisz and her presentation. Annette?
Thank you, Beth. Just bear with me while I share my presentation on the screen. I have been on sabbatical for several months now, and I haven't had to do anything like this. And what I'm having problems with, Beth, is figuring out how to put it into slideshow. Oh, there we go. Okay, got it. Thank you. Okay, so hello, everybody. My name is Annette Nierobisz, and I'm presenting my paper called Talking About My Generation, Older Unemployed Workers Critique the Workplace Orientations of Millennials, Boomers, and the Silent Generation. I want to begin today with a story that 60-year-old Helen told me when I interviewed her in August 2013. Helen had 2 advanced degrees, a master's and JD, and she was working part-time as a human resources consultant. Helen's previous full-time hours were reduced because her employer had just lost a lucrative contract. This was not the only employment predicament that Helen had recently encountered. From 2007 to 2009, Helen weathered 4 job losses that had overturned her middle-class life. Helen described the impacts of these experiences in the following quote. She said, "I lost everything during that 2.5 years of unemployment, everything. My townhome was foreclosed on. My credit was destroyed. I had nothing. I was living on money from friends and a little bit of money my mother would give me. She was making my car payments. I had nothing. I was getting food stamps and I was getting welfare." When Helen spoke further about the nature of her consulting work, she mentioned that she teaches organizations how to, quote, manage and motivate different generations at work. Helen referenced the baby boomers, Generation X, and Generation Y, otherwise known as the Millennials. And she shared some insights into the types of employment, quote, incentives that encouraged these generations to thrive at work. Similar comments are found in popular management books, and those books further suggest that generational differences become magnified in the workplace and lead to, quote, intergenerational conflict. So I'm going to back up and I'm going to tell you a bit about the study I conducted. I did a study of 48 interviewees who all experienced job loss from 2007 to 2014. People who came to my sample, there were 25 male presenting interviewees, 23 female presenting interviewees. Their birth year ranged from 1946 to 1962. Their average age was 59 years. All of the people I interviewed had lost white-collar jobs. And importantly, this is just something to keep in mind when you hear the quotes later on, everybody self-identified as white. So my interviewees lost their jobs again from 2007 to 2014. Just at the beginning of that period, from December 2007 until June 2009, That was the moment of the Great Recession. And it was shortly after that that you saw unemployment rates in the United States hitting what were then levels that had not been seen in 70 years. So my interviewees, their most common year of job loss was 2011, right? Just shortly after that height of job loss in 2010. Again, they were all white collar workers, and they were like thousands of other older Americans who lost employment in this same historical moment. Most of my interviewees encountered difficulties that they had finding new employment. They attributed their misfortune to ageism in the labor market. Perhaps because age was at the forefront of their mind, most everybody spoke rather, about different generations in relation to the workplace. So what my paper then does is it looks at the comments interviewees shared about these different generations. And in particular, they spoke about their parents and they spoke about younger workers. So my theoretical argument is that the comments interviewees shared with me reflect their embeddedness in two different socioeconomic contexts. On the one hand, interviewees, because they're born in that post-World War II economy, otherwise known as the age of security, they were socialized to believe that there are internal promotion systems, there are well-paying jobs, long-term employment benefits, health insurance. And they've also been socialized to understand that faithful and competent employees could expect stable employment, living wages, and numerous benefits that strengthened their commitment to their employer. So that is the age in which my interviewees, or that is the moment in which my interviewees came of age. However, when they experienced job loss, they were embedded in a neoliberal age of flexibility. Importantly, this age of flexibility emphasizes a flexible employment contract. Neither the employer nor the employee expects a lifetime employment scenario that we saw in the age of security. Okay, so what I'm looking then at in this paper is this group of baby boomers who've experienced job loss from 2007 to 2014, and the comments they're making about the silent generation and the millennials. Now, I just want to share an aside. When sociologists talk about generations, our starting point, we go back to a work written by Karl Mannheim in 1928. And he argued that groups of people born in the same moment in historical time, when they experience a momentous event, that kind of leaves an imprint on them that then creates a unified consciousness and that informs the future attitudes and behaviors of those individuals. So for example, the baby boomer generation, some of their momentous events were the Vietnam War, Woodstock, the civil rights movement. So Mannheim would say that those events left their imprint on the baby boomers and in turn shaped the kind of consciousness of the baby boomers and created a unified consciousness within that group. Now, today, generations are distinguished by a span of birth years. For example, Pew Research says the baby boomers are born from the end of World War II, about 1946 until 1964. And Pew also argues that generations have a kind of demographic trend associated with them. So for the baby boomers, we saw a sharp increase in fertility rates. And this was also a moment from 1946 to 1964. It was a moment of great social disruption in US society. Now, sociologists today say, well, hold on a second, there's a lot of variability within groups, and it's really hard to say that an entire generation of people born over a large time span, say 1946 to 1964, share a mindset. There are too many racial and socioeconomic and religious and so on differences between individuals to support the claim that that large group shares a unified consciousness. So where I'm going in this paper then is to say, is to use a life course perspective, which recognizes that birth cohorts may get imprinted by major socioeconomic or cultural events that happen in a time frame, and that then shapes their lives. That they're not claiming that everybody shares a common mindset. That's the difference. So that's my approach in this paper. I'm using a life course perspective. Okay, so going back to my interviewees and the themes I heard when they talked about generations, this was fascinating to me. I heard them talk about two generations. The first generation is the silent generation. That's their parents. Here, interviewees are establishing career and retirement differences between themselves and their parents, who are members of the silent generation. And then the second theme I just simply call the millennials, and interviewees in this theme are critiquing the millennial labor force and their millennial colleagues. And their comments reflect this intergenerational conflict that management scholars talk about. So let me tell you first about the silent generation. Now, importantly, interviewees did not say things like, oh, my parents are members of the silent generation. They did not use that vernacular. Instead, what they talked about were that their parents were part of that generation that, quote, grew up in the Depression. That was a really common comment across those 48 interviewees. And then consequently, they used that as a reference point to say that their parents imparted a kind of financial mindset that came from their parents' childhood experience of living in the Great Depression. 61-year-old Isaac, 54-year-old Christopher also both noted that they received generous financial assistance from their elderly parents. It's noteworthy that both of them had fathers who earned lucrative salaries in that post-World War II economy. And so it was those earnings that helped sustain Christopher and Isaac. Now, interviewees, when they talked about the silent generation, also presented a really nostalgic view of the careers and retirement experiences of that generation had. So coming back to Helen again, Helen said this in her interview: my father retired at 60. He spent 25 years on a railroad pension just hanging out, because it was like, oh my God, all my parents did was just hang out for 25 years. They went to Ireland, they went to Hawaii, all they did was play for 25 years. His gross income was probably $30,000 or something. I mean, everything was paid for. It's completely fascinating that anybody could live like that. Okay, so Helen is coming from this contemporary standpoint. She's lost her job, lost 4 jobs actually. She's earning part-time wages, and she is just stunned that her father and her mother were able to enjoy a happy environment. They were able to travel when he only earned $30,000 a year. Other quotes about the silent generation. Many interviewees, like Helen, recognized that their financial standing was diminished compared to their parents. 57-year-old Dawn stated, it's bleak, it is comically dark, it is depressing. I am of the generation that was supposed to have it better than my parents, but this generation does not have it as good as the one before. It is really sad. Several interviewees established exactly how the employment contract had transitioned since their now elderly parents were in the labor force. Margaret, a clerical worker who was downsized from a job she loved in 2012, shared this comment about some employment advice she received from her father. Margaret said, my father always said, you find a good job and you stay there, because that's the generation he was from. You find one, you stay there. And I think nowadays you don't. You get your experience, you get what you can from that company, learn as much as you can, and you move on and you take your experience and you get more money. Margaret is referencing this flexible employment contract that emerged with the neoliberal economy. I read it as she's telling me I understand the terms of employment in this new historical moment. However, what's curious then are the comments that interviewees shared about the millennial generation. So, popular management manuals, as I've already argued, suggest that multiple generations in the workforce will, quote, clash. They'll collide. They'll create friction. Intergenerational conflict was apparent throughout the comments interviewees shared about the millennial generation. 55-year-old Victoria and 59-year-old Sally shared a fear of finding jobs that required, quote, working with a bunch of 20-somethings. They've articulated that phrase word for word exactly, both of them, 2 separate interviews. 58-year-old Caleb mentioned a job opportunity that also attracted the attention of, quote, 2 young whippersnappers. 68-year-old Kat referred to the one little 30-year-old in the room who was downsized at the same time that Kat was. When 61-year-old Stephanie discussed the employment search she initiated after her 2008 job loss, she characterized the individuals reviewing her resume in this manner. 20-year-old HR people, what do they know? Sarah, 50-year-old Sarah, also took issue with an HR person, a younger HR person, who appeared to lose interest in Sarah after reviewing her resume. Sarah said, quote, she asked me to send her a resume and I did. And she said, I want to talk to you early next week. And I said, your schedule's busier than mine, so just give me a couple of dates and I'll respond as quickly as possible. And then I never heard back. I think this happens with a lot of Generation Y. She's Generation Y. I think she looked at my resume and went, oh, well, she's kind of older. Sarah's conclusion that she was a victim of ageist hiring practices perhaps reveals the insecurity created by a historical moment with high rates of long-term unemployment amongst older workers. Comments made by other interviewees revealed other personal insecurities, especially around their level of education and their ability to use technology. So interviewees specified numerous shortcomings of their millennial colleagues. They said that these coworkers are, quote, clueless or they're lacking expertise. In this passage, Sally, 59 years old, critiqued younger workers for not wanting to, quote, pay their dues. Now, just notice when I read this out loud that Sally switches from they to I in order to signify the phrasing a millennial employee might use when asserting themselves. So, quote, they're not willing to spend time to, how do I say this? They don't see that they have to pay their dues in any way, shape, or form. If I don't like it, I'm going to move on to the next thing. And then the other piece of it is, well, I've been here 6 months, I've done a good job. Now I need a raise or I need to be promoted. They want to go through those stages quickly. Okay, so while management gurus claim that the conflict between millennials and boomers is a natural reflection of their clashing generational personalities, in this paper I'm making a different argument. I'm saying that employer responses to the neoliberal flexible economy are partly responsible for driving a wedge between younger and older age cohorts. The insecurities expressed by my interviewees when critiquing the millennial labor force make this argument really clear. Interviewees understood who and what employers reward: youthful workers, technological savvy, and a college diploma. Most of my interviewees had a college diploma. A few individuals mentioned that they were comfortable using technology, but many others were not. All of my interviewees had aged out of their youth a long time ago. Now they were perceiving age discrimination, both in the workplace and in the larger labor force. So neoliberal ideology is recognized for its ability to divide and isolate socioeconomic groups from one another. Generational rhetoric, which appears to be intensifying, especially on social media, I believe also serves a similar function. In the workplace, attention is diverted from addressing age-based inequalities and scarce resources and redirected to managing the competing mindsets of different generational groups. In classic neoliberal fashion, the individual is seen as responsible for resolving problems that are located in larger socioeconomic and cultural transformations. Thank you.
Oops. Thank you, Annette. Still working on that unmute button myself. Sorry about that. Okay, next on the listing, I am listed next. Now I tried to pre-record this by doing voiceovers on my slides, since as you might be able to hear, my voice is actually better than it was, but I thought it was going fast. So I will go into, I think I will share screen first. Pete's sake. Okay. Stop that. Okay. I'll share screen. Okay. Slideshow, and let's give it a go. Hello, I'm Elizabeth Hoffmann. I'm an associate professor at Purdue University, and today I'm going to be talking about some of my research that looked at the accommodations needed for a specific group of workers when they returned from maternity leave. I looked at women who decided to breastfeed their kids and what they needed when they returned to work. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the research of what they needed, how the law supported that or didn't support that, how HR and how supervising managers did and did not support that. Lauren Edelman and co-authors have coined the term managerialization for the process of shifting the law's goals, such as quality or access, into managerial goals like turnover or morale. During managerialization, organizations create structures that appear to be responsive to the law's mandates, but actually are not. Instead, organizations create the symbolic structures that are merely symbols of compliance and don't create any actual substantive changes. When lactating employees return to work, they needed specific accommodations. First, they needed a place to express their milk. This needed to be a private place and ideally not a bathroom, since bathrooms are often considered not very sanitary and not a place where you'd want to handle food. And indeed, expressed milk is food for that baby. Lactating employees also needed sufficient break time to pump milk. This break time needed to include sufficient time not just for the milk expression, but also to travel to and from that private room, also time to set up the pump apparatus and clean the apparatus afterwards. Finally, storage was often an issue too, since that expressed milk needed to be stored until the employee went home. Well, a new law actually came into being a little while ago, and this is the focus of my study. This new law addressed all three of these points. The new law specified that lactating employees were to be given a private place to express their breast milk, and that this private place may not be a bathroom. The law also specified that employees needed to be given sufficient break time to pump, although what exactly sufficient wasn't specified. Sometimes this break time is paid, sometimes it's not, depending on the employee. And finally, storage. The law specified that either the employee or the employer needed to provide storage for that expressed milk. This was a truly new law. And so in that sense, it's very exciting because it was a little bit like the ADA, American with Disabilities Act, in that it had to do with workplace accommodation. It was a little bit like maternity leave, and that it had to do with specifically women's reproductive bodies. But there really wasn't anything like this before. So as a researcher, I found this particularly interesting. And when I say entirely new law, I really should say laws. I began by looking at a state level lactation at work law. In 2008, I looked at Indiana, which had passed this law. And then a few years later, President Obama's Affordable Care Act included a part that amended Section 7 of the Fair Labor Standards Act, basically replicating Indiana's state level law. I thought this was a very exciting opportunity to see how state versus federal level laws and compliance mechanisms worked. As it turned out, I didn't actually find a difference between the two, but nevertheless, it still gave me really interesting data in other ways. I wanted to see how this worked as organizations struggled with a new law, to what extent they created mere symbols of compliance, and what might actually work in terms of creating substantive changes. So I looked at who actually applied laws in organizations. Well, the first step, human resource personnel take the law on the books and transform it into organizational policies. Supervising managers then take those policies and make them into the everyday work experiences of their employees. So I looked at these two groups of workers. I interviewed human resource personnel and supervising managers twice. First at time 1, when the law was recently passed, and then later at time 2, 4 to 6 years later, I tried to re-interview as many people as I could. In addition, I also spoke to lactating employees, at least one in each organization in the study. So I had that perspective as well. At time 1, my interviews showed a lot of managerial talk. My interviews said things like, compliance is good for business. And I found this from both human resource personnel and from supervising managers. Now, their actual level of compliance varied. Sometimes the compliance was merely symbolic. It looked good, but it actually was not very effective. Other times, though, I did find substantive change. I talk about why sometimes managerialization did result in substantive change and effective accommodations in another paper. But anyway, then I came back at time 2, and I re-interviewed both of these folks. Interestingly, I found that human resource personnel were saying things that were consistent with what they had been saying. But now the supervising managers, some of them, were saying something different. At time 2, human resource personnel were still talking about managerialization. They were saying things like, it's good for morale, helps with turnover, things like that. Supervising managers, however, some of these folks have started to shift to health-related goals, and their compliance behavior shifted to not symbolic and not even adequate, but even beyond the basics of compliance, as I'll talk about a bit more. How did this shift to health talk occur? Well, very importantly, the employees themselves engaged in what I call educational conversations. They actually taught their supervising managers about breastfeeding and about pumping milk. They shared their values, they shared their goals about pumping and breastfeeding. And in doing this, the supervising managers became transformed into moral allies. This resulted not only in greater compliance, more creative accommodations, for example, but also more willingness to adapt the managerial needs like having to control where an employee's body is all the time, to instead really supporting their lactating employees and accommodating what they needed to successfully express breast milk at work. This quote from a factory manager really nicely describes sort of his own process of shifting from a managerial focus to a health issues focus. He said, at first, I'll tell you, I thought it was gross. I mean, it's a bit like excrement. I mean, that's what I used to think. Now I understand how beneficial that milk is. I mean, it has antibodies that help the baby stay healthy, and it helps with allergies and all sorts of other things. I had 2 women employees. They were both pregnant at the same time, and they both nursed their kids, and they both pumped. And at first, I just wanted them to go away and do what they had to do. But then they were telling me, like,
why they were doing it. It wasn't easy for them. It was a lot of work, but they believed that it was helping their babies be healthy. I really didn't understand that. I thought milk is milk, but human milk is made especially for human babies. In fact, each mother's milk is made especially for her own baby. Man, it's like, how can you not give the baby that? You want healthy babies. So this factory manager nicely describes his own process. Not only ignorant, but repulsed initially. Over time, he learned more about this and became a moral ally. However, it's possible he might have still remained a little bit squeamish despite being on board with lactating goals. I say this because nowhere in the interview did he ever use the term breastfeed, breast milk, or for that matter, even breast. So perhaps he remained just a little squeamish. Corroborating these descriptions of managers' education by lactating workers were evident in the interviews with employees themselves. They talked about how they approached their supervising managers. This office worker does a great job of explaining how she had to talk to her supervising manager. And through those conversations over time, he really changed from not really understanding her desire to express breast milk at work to eventually becoming an ally. She said, "When I was pregnant, I said that I wanted to breastfeed. My manager was like, why? I explained that breastfed babies are healthier, fewer earaches, fewer colds, they don't develop allergies as much, and so on. He almost didn't believe me, but we kept talking. When I came back, I reminded him that I was going to pump and what I had arranged. And he was like, you're really going to do that? I explained to him why this was important to me and all that. Every so often, my pumping would come up. Not like he was bad about it, just like, oh, right, you've got to pump again. And he'd say something, and I'd say something about the benefits of it and all that. And I started to feel like he was a guy and he just didn't understand. And then, and I could hardly believe this, but I overheard him explaining to a coworker about my pumping. They were scheduling a meeting. It was a busy time for the company, and I think the other guy didn't understand why I had to pump. And my manager was actually explaining all the health benefits and why it was important. I cried. I was there in the hallway and I turned around and had to go the other way because I didn't want to be seen crying. I couldn't believe it. So why did I not find health-focused talk among the human resource interviewees? Well, a big reason is that the supervising managers are the ones who have the day-to-day interactions with their employees. They're the ones who had to figure out what was going to happen while they were off pumping. Did they have to get another employee to cover? How to manage meetings? Sometimes where to find the space for the pumping. And so they had these day-to-day interactions, and they were therefore influenced by employees' information and values. Human resource personnel, however, they had much less contact with workers. They might have had some initial conversations when accommodations were arranged, but that was about it. In addition, human resource personnel work much more closely with attorneys, so they're focused on the law. And if anything, they're focused on shifting from the law as their big shift. Further focused shifts really weren't happening. Additionally, they're very influenced by human resource organizations, by those journals, by those conferences, which keep bringing them back to the managerial goals. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. This is a really complex topic. I have several papers as well as a book manuscript coming out, so it's a lot more complicated than what I presented here. So feel free to contact me and reach out if you have any comments or questions or ideas. I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'd also like to thank the funding agencies that have helped this happen. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for listening to that presentation, pre-recorded. Overall, I think it went okay. I might do that again. Audio, thank you. All right, let's turn to our next paper, which is Emily, and I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to her.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. All right, I'm not, you'd think by this point I'd be better at sharing a screen, but just give me a second. Okay. So thanks so much for attending our panel. I wanted to just give a little bit of a context for this paper that I'm presenting on today, because it's part of a larger book project that I'm currently working on, which is currently titled Hands Off Sexual Harassment, Resistance in the US Service Sector, 1935 to 2020. And the overall goal of this book is to really explore how workers in the service sector, basically since the advent of official formal labor law in the United States, have resisted sexual harassment. And each chapter of the book is going to look at different types of resistance. So for example, today's paper will be part of a chapter that looks at organizational resistance. Other chapters will look at legal forms of resistance. Another chapter will be looking at sort of micro resistances that often fly under the radar, ways in which we push back against sexual harassment, but may not make any sort of significant waves in terms of being recognized or acknowledged as such. So it's a much longer book project, but in the process, I've been gathering oral histories, conducting archival research, and trying to publish shorter pieces, as of course, as a historian, the pandemic has curtailed a lot of my research in the archives. So unfortunately, the book is going to take a little bit longer than anticipated. So the book Thesis basically historicizes how women workers have resisted sexual harassment in the service industry jobs. It looks at work that is gendered female, both union and non-union, typically low wage, and often requiring some form of intimate labor, which I'll explain in a moment. The project centers the body in the relationship between gender and work, because regardless of the type of service work, access to women's bodies is often perceived as part of the service that is provided. And it shifts the narrative away, from the victimization of women workers, and instead focusing on how women have demanded agency, both in their workplaces and in their communities. Oops, sorry about that. So when I talk about intimate labor, what I really am talking about is a project that centers the body in the relationship between gender and work. So regardless of the type of service work, access to women's bodies is often perceived as part of this service. So while some labor historians have included the role of the body in their scholarship, their theoretical framework does not really challenge the default narrative that the body only exists in kind of a historically masculine space, such as factories or mines. Feminist historians have argued for the body as, quote, a useful category. Eileen Boris and Ava Barone calls it a useful category for labor and working class historians to explore. My project responds to that call by advancing a conversation between labor history and a bodily turn within the study of the service sector. So my work challenges this dominant historical narrative that the body is, quote, a white male represented by bulging biceps and prodigious strength, and by default, someone who produces goods rather than producing services. The US economy is driven by occupationally segregated service economy that creates an inherently female workforce. And as such, my work argues that scholars must shift their framework to include the female body, both the actual body as well as the socially constructed body in the service context. So in a recently published book chapter, I examine how Unite Here, the union that represents hotel and hospitality workers in Chicago and Seattle, mounted legislative campaigns to fight back against sexual harassment by focusing on the unique nature of the hospitality industry's expectations that women's bodies are often considered part of that service. So that's just one example. So for today's paper, I'm going to focus on an organization that some of you may be familiar with called 9 to 5. 9 to 5, of course, is depicted here as a very popular movie in the 1980s, and also, of course, the famous Dolly Parton song, which I will not sing because that would be unpleasant for all of you. But one of the founding members is quoted here, Karen Nussbaum, who you may be familiar with, but this is just about the early founding of 9 to 5 in the early 70s. So we met for a year. We met once a week for a year, and we told each of our stories about how we got to be where we were and what we thought and what were our values. And we went through this whole experience, and then we talked about what kind of organization we wanted to create. And she says she's talking about office workers in the Boston area, which is where 9 to 5 was originally founded. We defined our goals as being understandable. It wasn't about radical analysis. It was more, you've got a problem on the job. It's probably related to the fact that you're a woman, and it's not an accident. So in the early days of 9 to 5, they quite frankly weren't looking for radical transformation. They were looking at really nuts and bolts ways to address very real issues of discrimination in the job. 9 to 5 still exists as an organization. It's a national organization. It's one of the largest women's organizations in the US. And in a recent interview I conducted with Lang Lang Chansey, who's the current executive director of 9 to 5, she defined the organization the following way, which is a radical departure from the early days of 9 to 5, which I'm going to be talking about. She says, and this is a quote, "At 9 to 5, our theory of change is all about our work grounded in racial and gender justice, and we use economic justice as a strategy. We have 3 main buckets of work that we work in. The first bucket is our workplace justice. In that bucket of work, we're advocating for equal pay, sexual harassment issues, paid leave, paid sick days. And then in the second bucket of work, we have what we call family and community sustainability, work such as childcare, housing, climate, utilities. We know that women don't wear a single hat. We all wear multiple hats. We're mothers and we're caregivers, we're workers, and all of the above. We're trying to encapsulate that, trying to look at it from a holistic workplace and then also family perspective. And then the third bucket of work, which is the bucket that really supports the 2 other buckets, is our power building work. In power building, we do civic engagement work. We also have the leadership development work. We have a justice fellowship program where we actually bring women in the grassroots that are most directly impacted by the issues that we work on to train them to become leaders in their own community and become advocates for themselves. So just to put that into context, that's kind of where 9 to 5 has gone from. It's gone from this very kind of practical organization to address predominantly the needs of white working class women in pink collar jobs to, my apologies, to now a much more sort of radical grassroots organization that's focused specifically on women of color and gender justice. So my article that I'm going to share about today, the thesis of this article basically explores one specific aspect of 9 to 5, which is the Job Survival Hotline and how it was used. So while the Job Survival Hotline was a unique source for workers, the hotline as a concept was not new. And this is the part that's particularly interesting to me in this article, is not just recounting the idea that there was a hotline and women called it, but the role of technology and the telephone as a critical organizing tool. So the telephone has been used as a critical organizing tool that has continued to evolve over time. The evolution of the telephone has allowed women to engage in private conversations that are important social process, serving to renew networks and communities. While it would not be until the 1960s and 70s that telephones would be nearly universal in the United States, the telephone served a significant role that in the 1920s, more households had a telephone than an indoor toilet. The General Federation of Women's Clubs president, Mary Sherman, commented in the 1920s, before toilets are installed or wash basins put into homes, telephones are connected, because the housewife for generations has sought to escape the monotony rather than the drudgery of her lot. Women quickly began to use the telephone as an organizing tool. During the 1948 meat boycotts in Texas, a recent article shows, housewives created a phone tree or quote chain using their social networks as well as the phone book to broaden and diversify the scope of their boycott. The use of the phone as an organizing tool linked to societal gender roles in which women felt more comfortable talking on the phone. So that's one of the keys to understanding this use of the hotline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the hotline itself, but keeping in mind that the article itself is going to be put into this broader context of the use of the phone as an organizing tool. So you can't talk about the 9-to-5 hotline without talking about Shara Kinsella, who unfortunately passed away, and I'm not able to interview, but I've been trying to piece together her life and who she was through interviews with other folks that knew her, as well as newspaper articles. So Kinsella was interviewed by an LA Times reporter, and she's shown here in a photo from that article. And her quote was, "Bottom line is they want cheap people they can spit out after they chew them up." So if we think about the continuum of our speakers today, thinking about that neoliberal model of flexible work, Kinsella's narrative definitely illustrates that. So in 1988, 9-to-5 launched a national toll-free number that was based in Cleveland, Ohio, called the Job Survival Hotline, hoping that it would help to, quote, develop a vision of a much larger organization and learn more about the problems facing women, working women, and to help millions of women who work in offices around the country. So using grant money, 9-to-5 was able to hire one full-time person to staff the hotline during business hours. And in the evening, callers could leave a message on the answering machine. They hired Shara Kinsella as the hotline staffer. Kinsella was described as a, quote, brash, quick-witted mother of three, who evolved into what some call, quote, a radical feminist and strident working-class flag waver. She staffed the hotline 6 hours a day. She was one of those people, quote, you could never knock down, who had experienced many of the things that women were reporting to the hotline. According to Barbara Otto, who was a 9-to-5 staff member and worked on PR for the organization, who worked closely with Otto, she said in an interview, "I think that came through in how she counseled women." Kinsella was a working class Midwestern white woman who did not grow up marching with Gloria Steinem and reading Ms. Magazine. Her feminist consciousness was born out of workplace discrimination. Having grown up in northern Ohio, not Idaho, a region that was shifting from prosperous manufacturing towns to shuttered factories and high unemployment, Kinsella was all too aware of the financial reality women faced. When she wasn't answering the hotline, Kinsella ran a singing telegram service called Red Hot Mama of the Big Belly Telly, where she belted out Sophie Tucker songs or parodies of Beatles songs. She wrote the songs often about the labor movement. So you can understand calling the line and getting someone like Shara Kinsella to talk to you. The Job Survival Hotline received thousands and thousands of calls a month. And so this is just the 9-to-5 did a study in 1991 called Business as Usual. And this is an excerpt from that study. You'll see that sexual harassment was was considered only about 6% at that point of the calls that they received. However, that number ticked up significantly after the Clarence Thomas hearings. On the other side of the screen, you'll see that the calls ranged from near 1,000 to up around 2,000. However, in March of 1990, you see a large uptick to 13,000. And so why do we see that large uptick? A big part of that is that 9-to-5 they were the masters of PR. So a big piece of drawing attention to the hotline was the National Boss Contest, which Barbara Otto, a former staffer, would run. And they were expert at getting news coverage. The National Boss Contest invited workers, usually women workers, would submit stories about basically how terrible their boss was. And then they would host a public event with local sort of news personalities in the Cleveland area or Ohio area and have a contest to see who was the worst boss in the country. And then they would direct folks to their hotline. And so here's just a few examples of that. And so on top of the National Boss Contest, also March being National Women's History Month and International Women's Day, they would often, 9 to 5 would often tie their work to those events, seeing an uptick then in the hotline and attention to the hotline. Here's a quote from Barbara Otto. We heard from a lot of women, and frankly, we got some entries from men. This is about the National Boss Day, who were really in unsafe workplaces, usually in the South. But also that was the beginning of the wave of video display terminals and repetitive stress injuries. Otto enlisted celebrity judges who could not believe that people were still working like this. The media attention garnered by the contest further promoted the Job Survival Hotline, resulting in press in magazines such as Mademoiselle, Ladies' Home Journal, and Money. And oftentimes the phone lines would be jammed up. Here's just a few other examples of some of the ways in which the hotline would be advertised. So I'm going to just wrap up here because I don't want to go on too long, and I want to make sure we have ample time for questions. But in terms of working to finish this article, which is in process and will be submitted in April, the two areas that I'm most focused on right now are the technology piece, as I mentioned earlier, focusing on the moment of telecommunications that allowed interaction, allowed interaction person to person between distant parties. And especially before the internet, which offered a very different means of communication. I mean, we've had a lot of coverage about, you know, how social media and the internet has blown up movements, but we haven't had as much discussion about what that looked like prior to the internet. So I plan to focus on the sociology literature as well as the history of technology literature on telephone communications, as well as looking at how the telephone is gendered and how the phone has been used, how the phone was used during the civil rights movement, by looking at records from the NAACP and CORE. And the other piece I'm working on right now is mainstreaming the sexual harassment as a workplace issue. So 9 to 5 focused a lot more of their attention on sexual harassment in response to the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas fiasco. So really, how did 9 to 5 work to help to mainstream the discussion of sexual harassment prior to the Me Too movement, right? So the Me Too movement has obviously brought this into the forefront in the 21st century, but this was definitely a conversation that was happening in the latter part of the 20th century, especially after the Hill-Thomas fiasco. And so what work did 9 to 5 do to help promote that discussion? So thanks, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Wonderful, thank you. So now we're going to turn our focus to our two discussants, Paul and Eric. I'll turn it over to you all, and then we'll open it up for questions from all the other attendees.
Eric, do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first? Do you have any?
Either way, you have a preference?
None at all.
Okay. Well, I can start if you'd like.
Sure.
Okay. Well, first of all, hi everybody, and I'm sorry you can't see me. It feels really marvelous not having done any Zoom meetings for 2 weeks, a full 2 weeks, and I don't know what's going on with my camera here, but it is what it is. So, thanks for the great papers. I guess to me, one of the themes that kind of tied them together was the kind of question of conflict, and conflict that was both structural and systematic, but at the same time kind of acted out in these very interpersonal ways that had a lot to do with bodies and women's bodies in particular. And then with Annette's paper, this kind of conflict between generations that was working its way into workplaces. So I think there's lots of interesting ways the papers work together, and I'll maybe mention a couple of those in the comments I have about each one. So for, let's see, Annette's paper on talking about a generation provides a very interesting, I mean, I think I learned a lot about the use of the concept of the generation in this paper. And I know there's, the paper kind of nicely brings in some kind of critiques, I guess, of the use of generations, but I took a lot from the point that the use of generation here is not about a unified mindset of a group of people, but rather how people experience these transformative moments, and what they kind of have in common about that. I guess the first couple, I guess I have 3 points, questions, I guess. One is if it would be kind of this idea of nostalgia, which was brought up in the paper, and how that ultimately plays out in a historical and cultural context. And so, I mean, if we think about the modern conservatism in general has in the U.S. is very much focused on the past, and whether that's in terms of, in very explicit terms, in terms of "Make America Great," or just more implicitly. And so I guess I was wondering how this research might develop or put itself into conversation with literature on how memory is used and how memory is constructed, and to what extent the silent generation here kind of experienced the age of security, and to what extent that's been this kind of constructed memory, a very politicized kind of constructed memory about what the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s represented and it was experienced. And I guess it would be, I guess another question I had was what this, I'm not sure if the interviews were done in particular in a geographic region. I'm sorry if that was made clear in the paper. But I mean, the fact that the interviewees were, well, one, I guess my question is, what were the differences between what the male presenting and female presenting interviewees said and everything, but also in terms of race, the fact that we have a white sample here, kind of what does the uniformity of some of their opinions tell us about whiteness in general? So those were some of my comments for Annette's paper. I guess the second one, Elizabeth's paper on lactation. This I also learned a lot from, and I guess to me the paper was really meant to tackle this issue of what explains the change in how the supervising managers talked about lactation in this particular context, and to what extent the workers and the women workers in particular kind of made these managers into moral allies. So I think that a couple questions I thought would be interesting for me anyway, were to think about, let's see, I guess maybe connecting this paper a bit to Emily's, about the question of unions. I don't know if there was, I don't think there was a kind of discussion about unions, and if the responses at union workplaces or non-union workplaces were different, or sorry if this was in the paper, or if, and I guess secondly about unions, if unions have tackled this issue very well or not, and thirdly, if the ways that the women here were agents in making this change, and even though women shouldn't have to explain these things to their supervisors, as you point out in the paper, the fact that they did, what does that tell us about women's power in the workplace, and could that serve as kind of a new way or a different way for unions or other labor organizations to think about kind of power in the workplace, a more women-centered vision of power in the workplace, maybe along the lines of something like 9 to 5 was doing. And then to get to the final paper, I guess I found the focus on technology really interesting and refreshing. I guess some of the material was in the slide. I mean, I guess what I was first thinking about was how 9 to 5 was doing things that other organizations, probably usually led by men, were kind of doing the same things, but later. That is how I was in 9 to 5 doing these things before them. So like the National Bond boss contests reminds me of Jobs with Justice's Grinch contests starting in the mid-90s. The fact of the hotline, I mean, my personal experience with hotlines is with immigrant worker organizing, and how immigrant organizations have used hotlines to deal with immigration raids, et cetera, since 2005 or 6, at least in my experience. I'm not a scholar of that, so that's just anecdotal. But here we have the use of the telephone as this very social technology in the 1980s. So to me, that's really fascinating. I know I'm familiar with a scholar at the University of Georgia, I believe, who's doing some work on, in the 1980s, we have this emerging phrase of the information superhighway, and kind of how I think some historians now are looking at, I mean, I guess I, for one, was in the papers of the Communication Workers of America a couple times, looking for something else. But I mean, I would love to see more working class histories of the information superhighway, particularly feminist working class history. So that was really fascinating about the paper. The final point I'll make about the paper has to do with, and maybe this brings into some of Elizabeth's points about the law. So in Elizabeth's paper and presentation, she presented us with this idea of how the managerialization of the law creates this focus on mere compliance rather than substantive change, and symbolic kind of procedures rather than real action. And so I guess I was thinking about that as when I was reading the material about the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the paper. And I guess I would be wondering, because I think in the paper, this 9 to 5 is kind of contrasted as a more kind of working class centered, street action, making bosses accountable in ways that the EEOC wasn't, because it was underfunded, et cetera. I guess one thing I'd be wondering about is, I guess, bringing into conversation about race in that discussion, if Black women had particular views about the effectiveness of the EEOC versus white women. In general, Black women's bodies are sexualized in certain ways, including in the workplace, that are different from the ways white women's bodies are sexualized. And I suspect you're working on that in some other part of the book. But that was just a thought I had as I was reading that material. But as someone I know in my own workplace and in my own union, we're dealing with a lot of these issues of kind of not specifically sexual harassment, but kind of workplace conduct in general and accountability. I found this paper super refreshing and eye-opening. So I appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody's work, and thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Eric. Do folks want to respond to Eric's comments, or do you want to jump into my comments and then take them as a whole? How do you want to run this, Elizabeth?
Why don't we hear both of you together, and then we'll respond, and then we'll turn to the attendees.
Great.
People know.
I will be brief because, yeah, Eric covered a lot of the major issues, and I'd love to give over as much time as possible to hear your responses to these, because I think these papers are really fascinating in really different ways, but they are also very complementary around this question of women's bodies in the workplace, and all of the sort of like generalized discomforts that come with, because one of the things I feel like these papers really capture is this fascinating moment across a span of history where you see women entering the workforce in ways that they are interacting with men in ways that aren't specifically around a gender division of labor. So it isn't just like the women are working in one part of the organization and the men are working in a different part of the organization, but you're seeing this sort of commingling. And then there's all these strains that come out of that commingling. I'll take the papers in order. Professor Nierobisz, your article on generational, it got me thinking about a whole bunch of things. First of all of them is to me, the sort of question or the backdrop of a shift in the general sort of like labor contract, right? There's this move from basically corporate paternalism to radical individualism in the workplace, right? And so the boomers come up, and the sort of early boomers and their parents enter the workforce under paternalism, right? But when they're leaving the workforce, they are witnessing this shift toward individualism. And you do wave a hand at that. You actually presented more of that in your presentation than was in the paper. But that is also facilitated by the second part of it, which is these tremendous shifts in politics in the United States, that the US has become much more conservative, and conservative in the way that we treat labor relations, right? And the irony there is that many of the boomers that you interview probably voted for the people that kind of messed them up. And particularly I'm thinking about the Reagan Revolution, right? And the Patco union strike, right? And that was a tremendous moment in labor history that really changed labor relations, not just for union workers, right? Although there was a massive deunionization over this time frame. And so many of those boomers probably entered the workforce in union jobs, and then, like all their parents, and that kind of is the subtext, though it's never actually talked about, is that the people, the one quote that you had about their parents taking trips to Ireland and getting this pension and basically kind of hanging out for 25 years, this is probably a union job, right? That afforded them that pension. And they're going into a place where there is no union job. And then finally, and relatedly, there's a huge shift from a strong social safety net to the dismantling of that safety net. And very much connected to that, but important for your study, is the reduction in investments in public higher education, right? That the boomers got cheap education. Many of them had the GI Bill, right? And millennials don't have any of that, right? And I know this because, Emily and I work for public universities, right? Like we see this, right? Anyway, so that context, I think, forms this backdrop, the structural backdrop that's informing the way that these folks are talking about the work that they're doing. But what was really interesting to me is how I would love to see the paper interview millennials to get their sense of some of this stuff. And the reason why I'm thinking that is when you ask the boomers about, why they're being sort of dropped out and excluded from the workforce, they all responded in these highly individualistic ways, right? That this is ageism, right? And they're sort of like individualizing the problem, as opposed, my understanding, and I don't do research in this area, but my understanding is that millennials tend to have a more structural understanding as to why the job situation is much worse for them. And so what is the difference? Why do millennials understand this as a structural problem? And so I wonder if part of the problem that this intergenerational conflict is not just in access to labor, right? But in how they understand the labor contract and how they understand why they're being excluded. And you're never going to resolve that if the boomers understand this as an individualistic problem and the millennials understand this as a structural problem. Right. So anyway, so that to me is like a really great tension that I see in your paper that I would love to see sort of brought out, because that to me was really the strength of what I got out of that, out of your paper. Professor Hoffmann, if you don't mind me, I guess I could call you by your first name if you don't mind. I grew up in New York, and so I tend to be super formal. My wife grew up on the West Coast, and she tends to be really informal. And so, I'm learning that I don't have to be so formal all the time.
Please call me back.
So Elizabeth, your paper is also fascinating in exactly that tension that I was talking about earlier, in this sense of like, when you have male bodies and female bodies working alongside one another, right? And it really speaks volumes to men's complete lack of understanding and knowledge about how women's bodies work in really fundamental ways. That's sort of like problematic for all these bosses and managers. But the shift that you see is really fascinating over time in your pre and post. And it was great to see that you were able to take advantage of that turning point to sort of adjust the study so that you could get this shift. I thought it was really fascinating, and that you could make more of the question of like, why did the HR personnel who are making this like fascinating business case for why we should afford lactation accommodations, right? And I love this kind of this business case talk because it's so fascinating to me. Why didn't that shift, right? So you talk a lot about why the supervisor shifted, but why didn't the HR people shift? Right? Like, is it because they didn't have the same interpersonal relations, right? Or were they just trying to treat this as kind of like a technical HR problem to be solved, as opposed to an interpersonal issue that they had to deal with, because they didn't have to deal with the sort of, HR wasn't responsible for the productivity challenges that making these accommodations created. And so because of that, they just simply never had to change their focus, or were they just consistently like just trying to protect themselves from some of the negative consequences of the policy changes that they kind of put out there into the environment, right? Against the, over and against the managers, right? In some sense, are they protecting themselves through this sort of like bureaucratic, very milquetoast business case framework, right? But moving on to the managers, I was very interesting to hear that the managers understood the health benefits, and then that the quote that you had from the government manager around like, well, this is good for the country, right? This very sort of like patriotic sense of like why we should allow women to breastfeed, right? But why didn't they think about it as a gender equity issue, right? Like, why did the health, I mean, I'm not one for frame analysis, but here I think you have a case for frame analysis. Like, why did this become like a health frame, right? And not a gender equity frame? Like, does it have to do with the timing? Does it have to do with the gender relations? Like, how do we account for this framework and sort of not the other possible frameworks that this could have taken place? And then finally, this is not necessarily for your paper, but it would be interesting to see this in the conclusion / discussion. Lactation is kind of a unique case of accommodation in that it is temporally confined, right? Like women lactate only for a certain period of time, and then they don't have to do it anymore. You know, it is, I'm trying to think of a sort of neutral term, intrusive in a neutral sense, in that it happens periodically throughout the day, and it you know, it has to happen on a certain time frame, otherwise it becomes very uncomfortable. And so I guess my question here is, do you think that the dynamics for different kinds of accommodations would manifest differently at the HR level and at the interpersonal level? And here I'm thinking about, like, you know, if I'm thinking old school, like ADA accommodations, right? But if I'm thinking more recently, as you see more trans people in the workforce, right? How might accommodations for trans bodies differ from accommodations for, you know, because I think that this is one of these instances where you have you can make a more generalized case, right? Beyond just the case of lactation. I think lactation is a really great case of an accommodation for changes in bodies in the workplace. And so it would be interesting to see how different kinds of bodies, how this affects different kinds of bodies, right? And then finally, Emily, your piece on the history of, I mean, this is great to framing this as sort of like the before Me Too, because I really saw this, and I think your presentation did a lot more of this work than the paper did. on looking at this survival hotline as a really interesting technology that creates a new social movement tactic that hadn't been used before. And that got me thinking of the sort of like, well, two things. One, in the social movements tactics literature, like why that tactic, why then, right? Like what does that tactic do for the movement? And then really basic questions like, as a technology, why the telephone, right? Like, and you know, granted, there is no email, there's no website that you could do this at that point, right? But like, why the telephone? And that got me thinking in the sort of like technology issues around affordances. Claude Fisher has written about this and the phone, but like thinking about like the sort of Gibsonian notion of affordances. What does the technology afford to the movement that they couldn't do before the telephone, right? And it seems like, you know, creating this mass of data is part of what the technology affords, right? And a sort of like national level database. Do you have this number that anybody could call to report these things? But then on the other side of that is like, what are the limits of the phone as a tactic here? What is the trade-off, right? What do you not get when you're relying on the phone, right? You don't have, for example, the visual aspect. So the women in their cases become abstracted, at least as, you know, one dimension, because now it's a voice on a phone that gets aggregated as data, like on the pages that you showed around like the pie chart, for example, right? All of those cases, you know, you say 6% of the cases were sexual harassment. Well, that 6%, that slice, is the trauma of thousands of women, right? That get flattened out into a single slice on a pie chart, right? Or even just the numbers, and you could see how they jump up, right? That's people's trauma that gets kind of folded into and flattened into. And so that becomes to me a trade-off of the movement, right? Because you lose all those individual voices when you are presenting this, when you're collecting this stuff in mass and presenting it as a mass of data. Then the sociologist in me wonders about the consequences of the hotline beyond just collecting and amassing this data and then presenting it to the public, right? Like, do you have evidence that this changed anything, right? Did these folks ever get called to Capitol Hill to testify for changes in laws, for example, right? And this may be hard to do because obviously we're in lockdown and you can't go to the archives to dig this stuff up. But it would be interesting to find out, you know, what effects this had for the movement, for the sort of general cause of gender inequality in the workplace, right? And then, you know, Eric talked a little bit about, you know, class and race differences in the calls, but I was actually interested in some of the other kinds of systematic findings from the calls, right? Were there variations in complaints by types of employment, right? Do we see like white collar versus blue collar, you know, in different kinds of, you mentioned there's this sort of surge of certain kinds of calls coming from the South, right? But do we see different kinds of employment relations generating different kinds of gender inequality that then get reported to this hotline? So I'll stop there. Thank you everyone for some really fascinating papers. I appreciate all the work that goes into doing them.
Thanks, everybody. Well, now let's turn to our attendees, and perhaps other people have a different, we have Mike, our assistant here. I'm unclear, how do we call on them since I can see the number of participants, but I can't actually see anyone? Do you just want to, we can embrace a certain level of chaos and if people just scream out their question, or we might try something else? Like we could,
I think they write it into the chat.
I was gonna say, well, we could write into the chat, like, do you just like put yourself on stack? Let's write stack or question in the chat.
And we could answer the questions that Eric and Paul raised as well, and then wait to see it come from the chat.
That's awesome, Annette. Great. Why don't we do that? And why don't you begin us off?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Great.
Wow. Thank you, Eric and Paul Brian. I mean, those comments were incredibly helpful. This paper I wrote in 2.5 weeks. And so I was like, where am I going with all of this? And you really helped me understand this is where I'm going with it. So thank you. Just to answer some specific questions. So Eric, you had mentioned missing the geographic region in which the study is based. It's based in Minnesota, and more specifically within a 75-mile radius around the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. This project is part of a larger book project. So what I presented to you is going to be the final chapter of the book. And in the book, the place of the study, the 75-mile radius around Minneapolis and St. Paul, and Minnesota itself is almost playing a starring role in the book. So I'm really talking about the geographic placement of my study because I feel it's really important you can really understand what these people are saying when you understand where this study is based. That leads me to this question that you raised about the uniformity of opinions that interviewees shared and how whiteness may have played a role. Kind of hinted at that very quickly in my paper when I talked about the memories that people shared about their silent generation parents. I said, when they're making these statements, these nostalgic statements about the silent generation's work and career experiences and retirement experiences, and when they're reflecting on their parents' salary and the secure retirements they are doing that through the lens of whiteness, because not everybody in that secure post-World War II economy had these secure jobs, had retirement benefits, had a kind of unspoken promise of lifetime employment. That was a very specific type of worker. That was a white male worker who had that. So, and hearing your comment, Eric, makes me realize I need to play that up a little bit. So thank you for mentioning it. The other way whiteness played a role in this study, I believe, is that I went through extravagant efforts, or I engaged in extravagant efforts to try and create a racially diverse sample, okay? I, for the life of me, could not get anybody attracted to this study, anybody who wasn't white. It was only white, middle-aged, white-collar workers who I recruited. That surprised me until I started connecting the dots and the stories I was hearing. And what I began to realize was, oh, this is the first time in their lives these people are experiencing discrimination, and they want to talk about it because they are mad. So it's their first time to have some kind of discrimination on the basis of who they are. And in this case, it's discrimination on the basis of their age. They've never experienced the women have experienced some gender discrimination, but what unites them is their anger over this age discrimination, and they want to talk about it. I believe that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, our new kind of phrase BIPOC, I believe that group has routinely experienced discrimination and doesn't necessarily need to keep educating, in this case, a white interviewer about it. So I think their whiteness played a role in kind of bringing them to my study. Let me see. Thank you for your comment, Eric, about memory and how memory is used and constructed and it's politicized. That's fabulous. That's something that I will definitely integrate into the paper. Now, moving on to Paul Brian's feedback. Again, thank you so much. Your comments are incredibly helpful. Thank you also for just using the term corporate paternalism and radical individualism. That is so much better than the terminology I was using. So I might borrow that when I'm writing the book. It's so, so good. So yes, indeed, these people, they are entering, their careers are beginning, and their early kind of workplace socialization through their parents and through elder mentors happens in this moment of corporate paternalism. but then they lose their employment in this moment of radical individualism, and they are a sinking ship. A number of them are experiencing incredible downward mobility, as Helen shared that quote I had at the very beginning. She's getting food stamps. She's going on welfare to try and manage her job losses. And so thanks for pointing out also that the US has become more conservative, especially in the labor context. And I didn't talk to people about their politics. This was, even though we had the Tea Party, so I did the interviews from 2013 to 2014. I mean, this is kind of, but not really. I mean, Donald Trump wasn't such a force back then when I was doing it. And so I didn't really ask I didn't ask any questions about politics, nor did I ask any questions about generations. I was surprised to hear interviewees bring this up over and over and over again. But something you said, Paul Brian, is their parents coming of age and having union jobs and the protections of those union jobs. And also the role of education and educational funding. It's like, oh yeah, that's a big gap in my paper. And so what I realized that something I need to do is now I need to talk about not only the employment relationship and its transformation, but I also need to talk about the three generations and their socio-economic contexts, right? I thought that was really important, and something, your suggestion to interview millennials, that's a great suggestion. I'm not going to do it only because I want to wrap up this project and move on to the next one. But let me tell you something. A week ago, when I was like, what's the big aha moment with my findings? I've become friends with a former student of mine who's a millennial, and we just happened to have a Zoom conversation. We were just catching up. And she had worked on this project when she was a student here at Carleton. And so I said to her, gee, I'm doing this paper on generations and this is what people are saying. And I'm like, what's the big aha moment? And she said, oh, and what she demonstrated, she helped me understand that workplaces pit generations against one another. And she framed it as like a Marxist argument. But in sharing that, what she revealed was indeed this single millennial, my N of one, right, is showing me that they have a larger structural understanding. And what I saw my interviewees doing was psychologizing their problems. They were offering psychological accounts and accounts that were focused on their own shortcomings. Perhaps their shortcomings led to job loss. And me, being a novice interviewer, would sometimes say, but what about the recession? Do you think maybe that played a role in your job loss? Like I'd have to redirect them to the big structural factors. So thank you, Paul, for bringing that out. That's really important. Let me just see if there's anything else. Yeah, your comment about like two different world views, again, based in these kind of structural contexts that they're experiencing. And that's all I have for my notes. So I'm going to keep quiet now and I'm going to let other people speak. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Annette. So I've unmuted myself. I think we'll go in the order if that's all right with you, Emily. Okay, super. Well, yes, Eric and Paul Brian, thank you both for your comments. They were really helpful, and I really appreciate your taking time to read our papers and give us these excellent comments and questions. So looking at some of the comments, I wanted to go actually to one of the questions, one of the last questions, and begin there regarding why HR personnel made the business case that we should do the lactation accommodations and they didn't shift. And I present it, I present it in the paper and in the presentation as very matter-of-factly. The reason the way I explain it is that it's the supervising managers who are hearing these educational conversations with the employees while HR is somewhat distanced. But also within the HR office, their job is taking the law and putting it into the organization. So their focus is kind of on the law, while the supervising managers focuses sort of on the day-to-day and the employee. But I like what I didn't emphasize in the paper, what I want to sort of throw out, which I thought was particularly wild, is I would have expected, if there was going to be a difference, the opposite. If there was going to be someone who was going to advocate for the worker and take on this additional like moral tone, I would have thought it's the person who is not going to actually have to deal with the accommodation. It's the supervising manager who, when that worker is gone, they have to figure out how to cover that part of the shift, or they have to work meetings around that lactation time. So I would have thought it would have been the HR person, the one who was more distanced. So the one who didn't have to deal with the nuts and bolts, and this is a negative word, I don't mean it that way, but the hassle of it, the day-to-day hassle, who might have taken on this ally role, because they could do it without much cost to themselves. And yet it was this, not all supervising managers, but some supervising managers who did. And I just, given their narratives, I think it just really comes down to the power of these women, not just advocating for themselves, but bringing them in, creating what some folks call moral allies, that shifting the rhetoric into this health frame. And now I forget if it was Eric or Paul who mentioned a quote that I don't believe I put in the presentation about this guy who says, it's good for us, it's good for America. And it's just like, I think it's the most bizarrely flag waving comment about some middle-aged white guy being pro-lactation. It's like, it's good for America. And that's such a shift. And I think that just has to do with that dynamic. That said, the sort of segueing though to about the question about transgender, I think it's, while on the one hand, I think the power of these educational conversations is heartening and is in many ways optimistic, because it means people can take any issue perhaps and educate about it and share both factually, but also in terms of their own personal goals and their own emotional and moral connotations for it. I think that's very powerful for employees. So on the one hand, I think that could translate into transgender issues. Talking about timing of hormonal shots, maybe that have to be taken, especially if someone's working a 12-hour shift. Talking about other issues that people, cis folks might not know. And yet I also am very aware that I don't want to, often, if perhaps even constantly, the folks with less power, the folks who need the accommodation, they have the burden of educating. They have the burden of educating the dominant group. They have the burden of educating everyone else. And so the negative side is like, while these educational conversations seem to be effective, perhaps, and powerful and helpful, it's like I worry that it's could be like one more thing now, that whether trans folks or lactating women or whatever group now has to do that educational work. Ideally, in some ways, if it were the HR person, they could champion. And as I said at the very end, this is a very complicated project. And there were HR folks who did champion. There are some folks who I called the allies already. And there were folks both in HR and supervising managers who were allies from the very beginning, who advocated for these women. So I don't want people to go away from this thinking that was the only way they got allies. But it was one way that they flipped people who were not allies already. So thank you for all the different comments. I can see we're at 10:02. So I think I'm going to pause there, because so many good things for me to think about. I do want to turn this into another book looking exclusively at the women's experience. So some of the comments that you both gave me, things about that tension between having male and female bodies at work, and how lactation is a sort of an interesting case for accommodations. It's, as you said, it's temporarily confined. And all your comments are so useful to me, and I really appreciate them. But I think I'm going to continue them. I have a file of things I'm mulling over and going to shift around for the next reiteration of this in a woman-focused book project. So I think I'll turn it over to Emily, and then I think we'll have time then for questions from the other attendees. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Elizabeth, I just had one comment or question about your project because and since you were just speaking, I was just going to raise it. I guess I was also curious about, and excuse me if this was in the full paper, but just also like workplaces creating physical spaces for lactating workers, right? So, because then it's like kind of a constant reminder to those workers who are not lactating that this is a need in the workplace, right? I mean, as a worker who had to deal with this after I had my children, it was like, especially when I was working in a hotel and I demanded an accommodation. I mean, every time I needed to go lactate, like half the hotel knew because they had to like call security to let me into this other room and and it became this like big event in the hotel, right? And so versus, now when I'm at like the Newberry Library, I'm reminded that like there's a lactation room, right? That like you can just discreetly go and lock it yourself. And there's not like a whole like public. So it's both a physical reminder that this is a need for people at the workplace, yet as the lactating worker, you don't have to like advertise when it's time for you to like go pump, right? So it's different ways of thinking about it. Anyway, just reminded me of that. But yeah, thank you to Eric and Paul Bryan for your comments. Super helpful. I think starting backwards, the comments around one, I really I wrote that down, like the trauma of thousands of women, that 6% I think is like, I'm going to use that. I'll footnote you because I really liked that. Thank you. But you do remind me. So I actually have spent all my time in the archives on 9 to 5. So luckily I have lots of good stuff. And there was a shift. The hotline existed for long enough. They actually just shut the hotline down in 2020. It was no longer like a fully staffed hotline. It had evolved into, just like a message machine. But they've held the number in case at some point it might go back into being. But one thing that they did do is they started to try to identify callers to try to move them into kind of like an activist role within 9 to 5 to sort of begin to recruit them to do exactly those things you're talking about, Paul Bryan, which was like testifying and becoming more of a public face. So I'll definitely, you made that comment. I was like, oh yeah, they did that. Like try to remember to bring that in. Will be really helpful. I think they weren't wildly successful with it, but there was definitely an effort. And so I guess the question is like, why weren't they successful with it? And I think for a lot of women, they appreciated the anonymity of being able to call. And, for most of these women who are calling, they were also in non-unionized workplaces. So not totally comfortable with this idea of like sort of collective action, right? And also just that like variations of the complaints for the different types of work. I think they only did that one study in 1991, business as usual. So that's kind of like the one sort of data set I have, but there's lots of other anecdotal pieces that showed up in the archives. So I can bring that in. But yeah, I think the piece that I am the least familiar with and the most excited about is that technology piece around, I was just struck by, Rosa Parks got active in the NAACP, right, by being like a rape counselor, right? And it was through phone calls into the NAACP office that would then, and in most of these places, Black folks didn't have phones in their homes, so they were having to like go into town or use a party line or use that one phone in the one neighbor. So like to just that experience of like having to get to the phone, make such a personal phone call to report something like that, right? And then the reliance on the NAACP to get that information and then use that network. I think that there's just so much rich material that can be used there. And I was reviewing an article about that somebody had written for a journal about the 1948 meat boycotts in Texas, and the work they did around phone banking was fascinating. Like they broke down like the phone books and like started randomly calling people in the phone books to try to recruit. So it just made me think about how the phone has been used and how little we know about that, right? I mean, we know that it was used, but we don't really know that much about it, and like how did that change happen? So when I workshopped this paper, that was the other piece that was definitely interesting to people, was that technology piece, so, which I was excited about, because that was the part that most excited me as well. And I wasn't sure if I was like off on a wild goose chase. So I'm glad you thought that was, you both thought that was interesting. So that's, I will definitely, you know, I've already been reading some Claude Fisher, but I think it was Eric who mentioned someone at the University of Georgia. So I'll have to check into that. And the CWA papers is another interesting kind of maybe aside. But yeah, I think there's a lot to look at, and then in just terms of thinking forward, like the impact of 9-to-5's work. Yeah, I'd forgotten about the Jobs with Justice Grinch campaign. So yes, very reminiscent of the National Boss Contest, which was one of the most successful programs within 9-to-5 for a long time. And the other piece of the hotline is, in addition to the immigration raids, is the Immokalee workers in Florida. The tomato workers set up a grievance hotline specific to sexual harassment. So that's actually one of those trips that's been delayed as a result of the pandemic. But you know, I have funding to go down to Immokalee and do interviews to find out more about that project and how successful it is, because I'm kind of curious. I mean, it's sort of one of those things that kind of like what Elizabeth was talking about. It's like, you have a law or you have an idea, but how well does it actually play out in reality, right? So I'm curious. It's like, okay, well, we came up with this hotline to be able to report sexual harassment, but how effective is that? How effective are they finding it? And to go back to your question, Paul Bryan, it's like, are they able to parlay those phone calls into building a larger activist base as a result, right? Like, what's the upside of what's the upside of sexual harassment, right? Like, how are you to do capacity building as an organization? So yeah, I think, I don't know if all of that will be in this one article, but definitely within the book itself. So thank you so much for your feedback. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so now if I minimize chat. Okay, if I go back to chat, I have some things, I guess, I don't know if all of you can see that from ASSA. I guess I'll type in any questions. So folks in the audience, our attendees, can we type any questions into the chat? We've got 15 minutes for questions from other folks.
While we're waiting, Beth, may I ask Emily a question?
Wonderful.
Okay, Emily, I was really curious to hear, you said this quickly, and maybe I missed it in your presentation, but I'm not sure. You talked about the telephone as being gendered, and I was wondering if you could say more about that. I was like, ooh, tell me more.
Yeah, I mean, that's not my research. I mean, there's been quite a bit of research around how women have used the telephone as like a source to build networks and to do more work, whereas men have found the telephone to be a sort of uncomfortable device and not relied on it, right? But also, you know, and this dates further back, I think, to men having spaces in the public, right? Like the bar or the union hall or other spaces where that they could, or the workplace for that matter, right? Where they could talk, versus women, especially women who were not wage working women, or, you know, housewives, using the phone as, you know, an opportunity to connect with other women, right? So whether you're doing it as a way to like call around, you know, as part of a phone tree for your children's school or for your community, if someone's ill, versus just, you know, to sort of gossip and find out, you know, other information. It's shown that women, and I don't have the citation right in front of me, that women spend a lot more time on the phone than men do, and are much more comfortable with using it as a device in multiple ways. I think I cite it, the article in my paper, which I shared with everybody. So yeah, it's definitely a gender device, and it's a funny, just as a funny aside, is that the book I published a bunch of years ago about consumer boycotts, there's this one anecdote where, you know, it used to be that people just had one phone line. I mean, when I grew up, we had a party line. We were on the wait list for like our own phone line. And then I remember like begging to have like my own phone number, right? Like my own dedicated phone line, which I never got. But, you know, in the 1960s, there was a big meat boycott, and one of the women that I interviewed, who was the leader of the boycott on Long Island, needed a second phone line because she was just like on the phone all the time with women from all around the country calling for advice on how to lead the boycott. And so she was able to work with her local legislator to move her to the top of the wait list to get a new phone line installed. But the phone line guy, the guy who came in to install the phone, was like, what do you need a second phone line for? Like, who needs a second phone line? You know, and as soon as they literally plugged the phone into the wall, it rang, right? And so just the way in which women are comfortable with using this device as an organizing tool is sort of fascinating, right? So I think there's there's definitely a literature out there around the gendered nature of the phone, but I think that there's also just through oral histories potentially, and newspaper coverage, an opportunity to kind of deepen that, that history a little bit.
You might find some studies also on the feminization of the telephone operator.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
The other thing I wanted to mention, it was sometime, my whole sense of time has been off in this pandemic. I'm going to say it was sometime in the last 4 or 5 months. I heard an interview on National Public Radio with the woman who founded 9 to 5, where they were talking about it, and they interviewed Jane Fonda, and she talked about creating the movie. So I'm just throwing that out there to see if it's something you heard or you can find.
Oh yeah, there's a new documentary out that's fabulous that Julie Reichart did. And there's actually, I've done a bunch of interviews with the 9 to 5 folks, and they've actually been doing, I don't know if anything's going to come of it, but they did a bunch of kind of, what's the term, like listening sessions and thinking sessions about doing a sort of 21st century 9 to 5 movie. So like a new reboot of the movie, and what would need done to make it relevant to the 21st century, which brings up a lot of issues, right? Like around race. I mean, race was, a huge divisive issue within 9 to 5. I mean, it was largely a white women's organization. They really struggled to address race explicitly, and it was very regional. In Cleveland, there was more diversity within the organization versus New England. So yeah, and obviously, the shift from like office work to temp work and the gig economy, and like how would all of that be represented? But Jane Fonda has expressed interest in like doing a reboot, but it would have to be, like definitely something that's relevant for the 21st century, right? But yeah, thanks for that. Yeah.
I was just going to say, for those of you, I think at least in the Midwest, PBS is showing that 9 to 5.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'll type the title in the chat.
If I can.
I have a link to it here.
9 to 5, the story of a movement.
Yeah.
This.
It's
Also,
here it is.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Well, if I can respond to what Emily mentioned about having the dedicated space versus having to find a space. That was something that I almost sort of went off on a tangent with the book and decided not to include it, but just tactically. It was something that was very interesting, the tension between having a dedicated, ideally it's great, it would be perfect situation would be if every location was within a few-minute walk from a dedicated lactation room. Most places don't have that. Some places would have a dedicated health room or an illness room. And that
Mm.
was interesting. One person talked about how she was at a place that actually was known for great employee benefits, and she said it repulsed her to express milk in a what she felt was a sickness room.
Uh-huh.
And what she explained was one time she found a used bandage on the floor, and she knew people went in there to take insulin. And I mean, insulin, it's not, you're not going to catch diabetes, but I think just the image of it for her. But it was there. It was a permanent spot. But you know, much not for her. She actually decided to sometimes go into a restroom because somehow everyone, you know, assess risk and assess things differently from themselves. You know, things that bother them. But other folks, you know, talked about how not having that room and having to always try to figure out, okay, this person's out for 2 weeks. I can use that person, that manager's office, and then going somewhere else. And then what about if there's a walk-in closet? Well, the walk-in closet isn't a bathroom, but it's certainly not very sanitary. And so it is the letter of the law, but not the spirit. And so that struggle with finding space is really key. But what I found most surprising were the folks who didn't, there were some folks, and it was a minority, who didn't take advantage of the accommodations because they felt it violated their sense of what a good worker was. And so what I developed in the book is that they needed 3 things. And I didn't bring this out in the talks much either because it muddied the water further, but they needed a physical space to pump, they needed time to pump, and they needed legitimacy of the enterprise.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't legitimate, they felt either in the organization or among coworkers and managers, they wouldn't go. They felt they couldn't leave and yet maintain their image as a good worker. But yeah, so that's I love your anecdote about when you were in, was it the hotel industry?
Yeah, I mean, I worked at a downtown hotel, and you know, it's like I was a waitress. I'd like leave the tables, you know, and everybody knew, like, because my colleagues had to cover the table, and it was just a bathroom. It was like the management bathroom on the 22nd floor. So like I'd have to go all the way up to the 22nd floor, and eventually I stopped doing it and just went to like the bathroom that I knew nobody used in the basement, which was like actually, you know, a hotel bathroom. Like it was a nice bathroom, but it was like a less frequently used bathroom because like the stress of like having to talk to security, having to notify security when I was done, like all of that also inhibits your production, right? Like just being under that kind of stress.
Sure.
So I was just like, I can't handle this anymore. Yeah, it was really hard. It was very stark to then when I had my second child and I had like, you know, my professor job and I could just close my door and be in my office, and so much more relaxing and much less stressful. Of course, I had just started my job, so like my brand new colleagues all knew what I was up to in my office. And I felt like I didn't want to be rude because the culture of the workplace wasn't to close the doors. So I was like, okay, now I'm closing the doors, but they don't know me. So I would just put a big sign up like pumping, do not disturb, because I knew it would be more embarrassing for my new colleagues to walk in on me. Right.
But that's interesting.
So
I think it kind of says that, at least within the culture of your department, that pumping and lactating was more legitimate than being rude and closing your door and walling yourself off from your colleagues. Yeah. Is that fair to say? That's how I heard you.
I think it is. I mean, it definitely made some folks a little uncomfortable at first, right? There were lots of like, oh, there's milk in the refrigerator, you know? But you know, I was just sort of like, well, you're all grown ups, everyone. Like, you all have kids, you all figure this out, you know? So it was definitely something they hadn't had to deal with before, but you know, but was much less stressful, which, I mean, the stress component is huge, you know, which I think gets to your third point about like the legitimacy of it, you know, being a good worker and is a really big part of it. But now there's like, I mean, I remember like lugging my pump around and I knew where every nice hotel bathroom was right in downtown in case I needed to go do it. But now they have like pumping pods at like the Amtrak station. And I mean, it's like a whole different world now, you know, so.
The whole Mama Lava things, the pods by Mama Lava. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. It's wild.
So thanks for your work on that. It's important.
Thanks for sharing your own experiences. It's fun. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
So we're at 5 minutes, and Mike has reminded us we're at 5 minutes. Anyone in our attendees who would like to? I believe you are able to post in the chat. If for some reason we're mistaken, but you can speak, feel free to speak. But I think we were told you could post in the chat. May I ask a question of Annette? So as you're talking about the different generations' orientation towards work and towards security and temporality and sort of the precarity of some jobs, I was struck with the statistic that I saw recently about how many millennials are still living at home. And I wondered to what degree that affects their comfort level with changing jobs and with precarity, because I mean there's still issues of having to buy groceries and health insurance, but if you know that bedroom with mom and dad's going to be there until you're 60, that's a whole different ball game, right? Than thinking like, I got to make rent. What are your thoughts on that, Annette?
That never occurred to me. That might also influence their workplace orientation. I see it in my own students. So I'm just drawing on my knowledge of working with students between the ages of 18 to 22, that that they have this kind of mindset that appears to be influenced by the neoliberal economy. And who can blame them, right? That to me is a completely logical response to the conditions that they're living in. Of course, they're not going to go in and give their all to an employer. Why should they? They know that employer is going to get rid of them just like that when the next downsizing strategy is underway. And so I read these millennials as being very strategic and understanding what this economy is about, and then enacting the values. But your point is interesting too, Beth. I mean, yeah, perhaps it's also having that comfort of living at home. But I don't know if that's true for everyone, right? So, but I think that's a point well taken, and it's something I marked down, and I want to kind of mull over that one. So thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. We now have 1 minute left, so I'm going to say goodbye, and perhaps we all should say goodbye because it's always a funny thing to get cut off in mid-word. So thank you, everyone, for being part of this. I hope you all stay safe and continue on with your amazing scholarship. And folks want to continue, we have a little email list going. Feel free to share revisions if people want more comments and such from other panelists. I'm not saying Discussants already did lots of work, but if anyone wants me to read anything else, I'm always happy to read something. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. What a great session. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Everybody.
Bye, everyone.